Support comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. Seattle's Lori Matsukawa spent nearly 40 years in news as an award-winning journalist and a role model for the young people who watched her on TV. In a minute, we'll talk with her about media, representation, and how to confront harassment towards Asian Americans. But first, let's get you caught up. We're picking up the pace of who can get vaccinated when. The Seattle Times reports that state health officials say all Washingtonians 16 and up will be eligible for a shot by May 1st. That brings us in line with the goal set by President Biden 2 weeks ago. Yes, eligibility is not the same thing as having enough vaccines for everyone, but right now, 1 in 4 people in Washington have at least one dose. The family of Tommy Lay has settled a lawsuit over his death. Lay was fatally shot by a King County Sheriff's deputy in 2017 while carrying a ballpoint pen, which the deputy said he thought was a weapon. The family will receive $5 million, but Lay's father said yesterday no amount of money could replace his son. A lawsuit against the deputy has been dismissed. And finally, you won't be able to get a COVID test at the city's Rainier Beach and West Seattle sites much longer. The city announced yesterday they'll stop testing so they can start vaccinating. Up to 3,000 more shots a week. Seattle Fire Chief Harold Scoggins says the demand for testing has dropped over the last 6 weeks, but it can be scaled back up again if needed. Hey again, just a quick note before we jump into today's show. It's our spring membership drive here at KUOW, and this podcast that you're listening to happens thanks to people like you who support it. Join us as a monthly member today by giving at KUOW.org. If you're already a member and you can pitch in a bit more right now, we'd really appreciate it. There's a link to donate in the show notes of today's episode. And thanks for listening and supporting Seattle Now.
Number 1 at 11. Coverage you can count on for all of Western Washington. This is King 5 News at 11.
Okay, here's a story about who gets to tell stories. It happens here in Seattle about 20 years ago.
I know it seems like there have been people of color on the anchor desk for so many years, but it's not that long ago.
It was actually 1998. Pearl Jam had 4 or 5 albums out by then. And Lori Matsukawa was the first person of color to anchor the evening news on King 5.
So things were going great, I thought. And then, bum.
It was just a year and a half later, and she was out.
And very suddenly, too. I was just called into the news director's office. He looks at me and says, I'm taking you off the 11. You're being replaced by a white woman. And I'm going to go out and tell the whole newsroom in 2 minutes or 10 minutes. And I'm picking myself up the floor. And he's out there in the newsroom announcing how we had this new anchor at 11. And Lori is just going to stay on Kong. And I was just devastated. There was silence in the newsroom, right? People couldn't believe it. That it was so sudden.
Viewers couldn't believe it either. They pressured the station to bring Lori back. And about a week or so later, management gave in. But she had to make a choice.
And I decided to stay because I felt like I still had a platform. And I felt like if I at least stayed, people would see and people would say, yeah, there are people of color on the air here in Seattle. And who knows, maybe the next generation will be inspired and say, okay, I see her. I can do that too.
Yep, that has definitely changed. But a lot of other stuff hasn't. In fact, anti-Asian violence is surging in the U.S.
So if you turn on the television now, wow, you will see journalists of color and many Asian American journalists. It's not unusual anymore. But what's happening is journalists out on the streets are getting harassed, spat at, yelled at, and even in their own newsrooms. they're getting pushback. Like when the murders happened initially in Georgia, some journalists told stories of how they had to fight to get their news directors to cover it as a crime against Asians, and especially Asian women. And they would find themselves alone and unsupported in their own newsrooms.
So much of this still continues. And I wonder if specificity matters a lot right now, because social media has changed the way we're talking about this.
It definitely has. And I think this kind of expression and exposure to the general public of what Asian Americans have been putting up with through decades, through centuries, but even today. Just yesterday, I saw a message from one of my colleagues, and he said he was sitting at a stoplight, right? And these three white guys in the car next to him, are pulling up their eyes in a slanty way and saying, "Ching Chong, Chinaman." And
oh my gosh.
He said he couldn't believe that he was hearing it. He just kind of said, okay, I'm just going to get through this intersection. I'm going to get through this day. And he said, but you know what? Deep down, it still hurt. So it's time to express the hurt, express the anger, and get beyond a very famous Chinese phrase, eating our bitterness. We have to get beyond eating our bitterness and sharing this hurt and outrage with others.
And that harassment you just described with that guy in the car, it doesn't make the news, but it happens every day.
I know. And I think other people of color, especially those in the African American community, can totally relate. Every day is a daily barrage of microaggressions, ignorance, racist comments, and it's to the point where you cannot acknowledge and get outraged over everything, because otherwise you just go nuts. And then, of course, the last 4 years being targeted with slurs like, Kung flu and Hong Kong flu and China virus, and all those kinds of things have just made us targets and more exhausted. And I think it's still having its effect. That's why my friend yesterday was able to post about his incident at the intersection, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You've talked, Lori, about the model minority myth before, and I think it's always worth breaking this down. I have heard you say you've been asked, what is so hard about being an Asian woman? And I have seen it on social media. What is wrong with being considered a model minority? Hey, this is a good thing. People are saying you're cool, you're all right, you're strong, you're tough. What do people need to understand about this?
You have to recognize it as a tactic. It is I hate to use this word, but it's white supremacist idea that somehow you are behaving like white people, so therefore you're successful, not like those other minority groups. It's just so damaging, and it's just untrue. Asian American people, as we see, are suffering just like other communities of color. And, to have our elders attacked on the streets, to have our children bullied on the schoolyard grounds, and to have our identity defined by white structures. I was talking to an actress friend of mine, and she said, she was 15, and the only role she could audition for was for an Asian prostitute. Mm. So I think what the murders in Georgia have taught us is that not only are Asians targeted, but Asian women have like a double burden of being objectified, right? And so they become targets too.
This explains why Asian women are targeted, right?
Exactly. And according to the Stop AAPI Hate website, 2/3 of all the attacks that are reported are against Asian women. And it's because of this imagery of being submissive, not going to report anything, right? Weaker. And it's interesting that the other majority of reports involve the elderly and children. So
vulnerable people.
Very vulnerable populations are targeted.
Yeah. Lori, you know this better than anybody. The national media spotlight is white hot, but it burns very, very fast. And, the dialogue has already moved into guns now. What else has to change to get us to the next level of understanding and equity?
I think people are looking for solutions, and it's not necessarily in more police law enforcement. I don't think that's the solution. I think the solution is allowing the funding so that police can maybe track the amount of reported hate crimes. Up until now, it's been kind of an option for local police departments with no funding. So, of course, you're going to get very low levels of reporting. People just have to understand that this is a highly underreported thing, Asian harassment. Many times people call the police if they're assaulted in a parking lot, but nothing happens because the police are unsure of what they should do or can do. So if towns and states and the country can define better what hate crime, hate harassment is and make it actionable, that might be good. As individuals, what can we do? We can educate ourselves about the issues against all communities of color. It's not just an Asian thing, right? And take bystander classes. Go and learn how you can be an ally, how you can be an effective bystander. If you see harassment going on or a hate crime going on, how do I get involved for the safety of myself and the person being harassed?
And get involved effectively, right? Because so often... and I'll take this as a white person. We fumble through these things, Lori.
Right.
So,
or our uncertainty makes us do nothing, which, could be really bad. And then as a country, we just need to educate ourselves about our history. It's taken this long for us to really kind of get to the point where we're ready to look at our racist institutions. We are a systemically racist society. Our history shows that. So we need more ethnic studies. We need more history lessons that shine the light on the history of actions against indigenous and communities and people of color. Absolutely.
And maybe continued specificity about what's happening to people. So we're not talking about generalities.
Yes. And I encourage all the people who have a platform to take a stand and use that platform to just kind of end that whole story about how I was demoted off the anchor desk. About a couple years later, the woman who replaced me left the industry and went to do something else. And so they asked me, Lori, can you fill in this 11 o'clock position until we complete our nationwide search for a replacement? So I said, yeah, I'll fill in. And I ended up filling in for the next 17 years until I retired.
Did you go home and say, damn straight I'm going to fill in and I'm never getting out of the chair? I just want to know because that's what I would have said, Lori.
I tell you, it was one of those things where I said, I've got a platform and I'm going to keep it. And I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Lori Matsukawa, former anchor of the King 5 Evening News, retired from journalism, but always a storyteller. Thank you. I really appreciate your taking the time today.
Patricia, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.